we had done an examination of the stories of Liesl Loeb, Esther Clifford, and revisited the story of Otto Frank, which we had taken a look at the first day and which many of our students are familiar with. And one of the things that I had shared with you on the very first day was the fact that everyone has this misconception of, why didn't they just leave? And we looked at some of the immigration numbers and the fact that actually in the early initial time period following Hitler's rise to power, there were only about 35,000 Jews that desired to leave Germany. And then that number actually dropped a little bit heading into 1936-37. And then in the aftermath of Kristallnacht, it nearly doubled. And that was the amount of people that actually left. But what the story that did not tell was the amount of applications there were specifically for US visas. And so it talks here on this particular slide about in the aftermath of Kristallnacht, there was a significant uptick in the amount of visas that were being sought by individuals to leave Nazi Germany and annex Austria and the occupied Sudetenland and come to the United States. And so the numbers are more than double between late 1938 and June of 1939, a time period that we're going to come back to a little bit later in our program. And by the end of this time period, the wait period to get into the United States, if you were waiting for your quota number to be called, was nearly 10 years. So you would have had to file for a quota number and then wait 10 years in order to have that quota number called under normal circumstances. And so these numbers obviously are showing that now an immense amount of people want to leave, but of course the United States is refusing to increase their quota. The strict quota of the Johnson-Reed Act limited entry to immigrants to the United States based on their country of origin. And so this actually was a fairly complicated formula, and Gabriel asked yesterday about, how racial aspects, ethnic aspects factored into this. And what the United States actually did to create the quotas under the Johnson-Reed Act was they looked at 1890 census data to determine admittance numbers per country. And this data really benefited, England and Ireland, ironically, the most at the time. Germany had the second highest quota, yet due to the number of Jews that were fleeing Germany, the wait period was so incredibly long. Additionally, many of the Jews that were living in this area of Nazi Germany at the time had emigrated to Nazi Germany, fleeing pogroms from Eastern Europe, and were not actually established citizens in Germany as their country of origin. Because also keeping in mind, too, that the 1935 Nuremberg laws strip the German Jews of their citizenship. So there's just so many complicating factors to think about based on numbers. And so during the 1930s, of course, as we previously discussed, there was no refugee policy. You couldn't go somewhere and declare asylum. The only way that you could get into the United States was through that slow and careful immigration process that we examined on USHMM's website yesterday, requiring applicants to provide extensive documentation about their identity, background, financial resources, and medical history. During FDR's first term, between 1933 and 1937, less than 20% of the German quota was actually filled. And it would really only be in 1939, and there's actual visual statistics for this on the USHMM website, that quotas for Germany and Austria were actually filled to their capacity. And then that repeated in 1940 and then did not happen again. And so it's, incredibly interesting to think about the lost opportunities, and tragic to think about the lost opportunities in the quota systems that were not filled. And in the aftermath of the annexation of Austria, the Anschluss, the quota numbers for Germany and Austria were combined into one group. So that complicated factors even further. And so to just give you a visual representation of that, you have here, showing that in 1939 the quota was filled. I mentioned that repeated in 1940, but then dropping again now, also thinking about that we're in wartime. In fiscal year 1941, 50% of the quota was filled, and then in fiscal year 1942, 20% of the quota was filled. But in the aftermath of the outbreak of war, the challenge of immigrating is intensified because of the fact that these are enemy countries, and therefore not so easy to get from that nation to the United States. You had to go through other steps in other nations to get there. But what this ultimately shares with us is the establishment of what historian David Wyman called paper walls. It was, truly, and there's going to be another quote that I'm going to share with you that really illustrates these paper walls. But this stoppage of immigration through bureaucratic channels and the enforcement of so much paperwork. If you have the opportunity to get to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum when things get back to being somewhat normal, or even you'll have the opportunity, I'll have to see if I can find this link. The curator of the Americans exhibition, Danny Green, does like a video walkthrough of the exhibition. There's a part shortly after you enter the exhibition where they have glass walls that are filled with all of the immigration paperwork that was required for individuals to come to the United States, almost really illustrating that concept in a very physical manner of the establishment of these paper walls. And it worsens after the outbreak of war, and especially after the surrender of France in 1940, because many of the rumors that were circulating after the fall of France was that France was brought down by a network of spies, by this so-called fifth column. And Americans grew even more concerned that immigrants, even Jewish refugees, posed national security threats. And State Department officials were instructed to reject all visa applications for anybody that could even remotely be considered questionable. And then, of course, after the outbreak of the war itself, transportation was incredibly challenging. To go from Europe across the Atlantic became physically more difficult because of the fear of, mines that were being placed in the water. And shipping lines themselves had their passenger boats requisitioned for wartime use. And fewer transatlantic voyages is going to mean fewer opportunities for immigrants to actually travel. And so all of that together really helps to complicate the story. And, we heard from Esther yesterday, and I think that the tone of her voice when she's sharing this particular component of her testimony is so heartbreaking. And she says, one country after the other closed their doors. We just couldn't go any place. We had no place to go. So I'd like us now to revisit the mentee that we've been working on and showing you again a different way to use mentee than we have together in past workshops. But I'd like you to go again and just add another word that comes to your own personal mind when you are thinking of the word refugee. And actually, let me just double check that the code didn't change on us. I think it might. Nope, we still have the same code. So you're going to go again to mentee.com, and the code is 935655. So add another word that comes to mind now that we've continued our exploration of this concept of refugees. As you're doing that, I'm looking in your book recommendations. Someday I want to read Daniel Silva. I have not yet read any of his books, so I really do need to do that, Corey. And I actually just downloaded Stamped from the Beginning. Our Holocaust Museum Teacher Fellow group was reading it, and I need to get caught up. And I really do want to read 28 Summers as well. Elin Hildebrand's a favorite of mine, and I'll have to check out some of these other books. They look pretty good. I think I actually have the Harlem Hellfighters books. I'm going to have to dig that out on my shelf and have to check out some of these recommendations. So thank you guys for those. Looking at the mentee now, I see desperate is just still really standing out for us. And overwhelming is also a word that comes to mind. Still seeing lost and victim escape, difficulty alone, trauma, frightened, rejected, violence, and alone. So while all of this is happening, you know, one of the questions that students will often ask is, you know, why didn't this happen? Or why didn't that happen? Or why didn't the United States? Or why didn't, are things that we really commonly hear. And they're great questions. And I think they're questions that show that students are engaging in critical thought. But I think that sometimes they're also questions that students ask without thinking about the deeper implications. And so in Unit 8 of Echoes and Reflections, which focuses on perpetrators, collaborators, and bystanders, we have an activity which I've included in the working document that I'm now displaying on the screen. I'm going to also provide you guys a link to Unit 8 under the US and World Response section here. I'll fix that link in just a second. But you see here one of the opening activities, and it's an activity that I've done with my own students. And it's one that I think has really generated great conversation. And it's regarding the responsibility of nations. And I've actually done this activity as an opening activity for a discussion on immigration before my students like really realize where we're heading with the conversation. And ask them just to think about, you know, what is the responsibility of other countries intervening in a crisis? And I don't even necessarily say what was taking place in Europe. I just say in a crisis, what is the responsibility of other nations? And I ask my students to think about, you know, deeply, which of these 5 statements do they think fits their own position on this topic? And sometimes the answers that you get from your students are surprising. And then I ask them to get into small groups. What I really particularly like about how this activity is structured is this is not an activity that is structured in such a way for one student to get the other students to agree with them. In fact, I very sincerely stress to the students that I want you to say, I believe in statement number 1 because, and leave it at that. I tell them that you shouldn't say words like you should believe or you should do or we should. It is I believe this, and leaving it to the point that it's very neutral. And I ask them to have the discussion with each other on why they believe what they believe. Then I ask them, once they have all had a chance to share, to then discuss something that another person in the group brought up that gets them to, you know, perhaps not necessarily reconsider their position, but appreciate or understand why the other person has a position that can perhaps be different than their own, or that reinforces their own position in a new way. And I find this to be a really great activity. It's not one that I think we're going to have time to do today as a group, but I think it's a really great activity for students to think about, you know, our universe of obligation, as Facing History calls it. And it's one that I've, like I said, I stand behind because I believe it's had some really great outcomes for my students. What I would then have them do next is explore the resource that is located below. And that is on the Evian conference, which I'm now opening for all of you in on the screen. This is a pretty simple one-pager that tells us a little bit about Evian. And what I would like you to do now is I would like you to read through this, whether you open it with the link that I'm sharing in the chat box or on the master document, or on the screen itself. And once you have read through these 3 paragraphs, in the chat box, I'd like you to share something that you either learned, a question that you have, or some other connection that you can make. So an LQC, something you learned, a question that was generated, or a connection that you can make to something else. So go ahead and pick, you just have to do one. You don't have to do the L, the Q, and the C. Just pick one and go through this. A connection to now or even to another period in history. Okay, so connecting to now with Syria. I always got to remember to unmute myself. Most MENA countries, specifically Jordan, took in Syrians. Connection to now, Corey mentions the problematic fear of refugees taking jobs and being a drain on the economy. I see Kristen mentioning that it connects to many comments from students about immigration and refugees, the idea that we are full. Shane's wondering about the metric that was used to determine whether their countries were fully saturated and could accept no more refugees, which is a really fascinating question. Yeah, and so the Evian conference, you know, in some ways, I think many historians viewed it as a Band-Aid. It was also incredibly telling that, you know, some of the people who were attending the conference, you know, made statements that showed that they had absolutely no qualms about expressing their distaste of the situation. This one here from the Australian Minister for Trade and Customs, T.W. White, as we have no real racial problem, we are not desirous of importing one by encouraging any scheme of large-scale foreign migration. I hope that the conference will find a solution of this tragic world problem. Like, absolutely, you know, just lays it right out there how he feels about this particular situation. And really doesn't get a lot of pushback. You know, from the individuals that were participating, the 38 nations that were participating in the conference, the messaging is very, very similar. And, you know, in the end, only one nation, the Dominican Republic, you know, agrees to actually take refugees in any large quantity. They had ulterior motives because they wanted to whiten their own population, which was, you know, something that obviously had its own racial motivations. And the history of the Dominican Republic at this time is already also a challenging history. You know, in the end, you know, as a way to uphold the spirit of the conference, FDR demands that all of the quota spots for the United States be used, which ends up being why 1938 is the first and only year that all of the quota spots are accounted for. But this is the reaction from Nazi Germany. Since in many countries it was recently regarded as wholly incomprehensible why Germany did not wish to preserve in its population an element like the Jews, it appears astounding that countries seem in no way anxious to make use of these elements themselves now that the opportunity offers. And Gabriel, I am not even going to attempt with my very poor Spanish to attempt that word. But if you want to pronounce it for me, I would greatly appreciate it.
Emblancamiento.
Okay, emblancamiento. And what does that translate to?
Basically to make them white.
Okay, so that's the terminology for the whitening of the population.
It's in Portuguese, a similar phrase, Spanish, but the whole whitening process and taking in, like what the native populaces, in particular Argentina, but like all of the countries had some semblances of it.
Okay, thank you for sharing that. Yeah, and I don't know how widely available the resources are yet through the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. But for those of you that teach with Latino populations, one of the education initiatives program leads at USHMM has a background. She's from Texas. Excuse me one second. Okay, my daughter has apparently turned on the TV volume from another room, so excuse me one second. We don't need the Jetsons full blast while talking about serious topics. Anyway, she's a phenomenal resource in discussing the history of South and Central America when it comes to immigration. So if any of you have populations that would particularly benefit from a discussion on that topic and a lesson plan on that topic, just let me know. All right, so we're now going to head into the United States. Yeah, she actually talks quite a bit about the converso. She is a wealth of knowledge. She's originally from El Paso and then was with the Holocaust Museum in Houston. And so, you know, when the Evian conference is happening in the United States, there is some media coverage of this topic, but it's not extensive. And the extensive media coverage comes nearly a year later, in May and June of 1939. And that is with the incident that today we refer to as the St. Louis incident. The incident surrounding the St. Louis actually begins in May of 1939, when a corrupt Cuban official begins to distribute landing visas to Jewish refugees, many of whom already had US quota numbers, to encourage them to take this voyage to Havana, where they would disembark and remain until their US quota number was called. En route to Havana, the captain of the ship, Gerhard Schroeder, discovers that he gets a telegram from his parent company and finds out that most of these landing visas have been invalidated by the Cuban government in response, in part, to the fact that it was discovered that they were distributed under fraudulent means, but also due to pressure from Cuban citizens in regards to the fact that there was a pretty high degree of anti-Semitism in Cuba at that time. And so when they land, they're not allowed to disembark the ship. I believe in total 7 passengers who had different landing visas were allowed off the ship. And then for a period of several days, the ship steams back and forth between Havana and Miami after having been anchored outside of Havana for an additional few days, where the American Joint Distribution Committee is attempting to bargain with the US government to allow the refugees to disembark. Roosevelt does not respond, and in the end, the ship is turned back to Europe. Schroeder actually disobeys the orders of the parent company and drops refugees off in England, France, and the Netherlands and Belgium before returning back to Hamburg with an empty ship. And he did manage to save the lives of some of the passengers by making this decision that these 4 countries were willing to accept these individuals. He's fired by the Hamburg America line, and later in life, the surviving passengers of the St. Louis end up helping to support him. He managed to save approximately 2/3 of the passengers, but a third perished in death camps during the Holocaust, and others, even out of the 2/3 that survived, still underwent many of the horrific experiences that we associate with this time period. The St. Louis was all over the news. And one of the really fantastic resources that you can learn more about this particular event in your own communities is an event, is a website called History Unfolded. History Unfolded is part of USHMM's Americans in the Holocaust research efforts. It's a citizen history project, and Gabriel, just thinking out loud, we could in the future do a 1-hour session on this. USHMM and I would love to do that because I've involved with them with this project, and the project manager I know would be thrilled to share it with Social Studies Network. But it's something you can do with your students. You can engage them in true project-based learning to contribute findings from your own communities to the database that has been established by USHMM that is being utilized by historians to bust the myth that Americans did not know what was happening about the Holocaust as it was going on. The project centers around 43 different events. The St. Louis is just one of them. You can already look and see what has been submitted, and in some cases, your communities. Yeah, absolutely. We'll wait during the school year. But you can see some teachers in surrounding communities to you might have already submitted articles. So I'm going to go and I'm going to filter it to the St. Louis, which that event is called Jewish Refugees Desperately Seek Safe Harbor. And I'm actually going to filter it to my own town, which during the time of the Holocaust was very, very small. Only had 11,000 people. And so you would think a very small segregated Virginia community with 11,000 people may not heavily cover this event, but we find out in fact that there were 11 different articles dealing not only with the St. Louis, but also some other ships during the vicinity of the St. Louis landing that were covered also mainly on the front page. And so this was a very widely covered event that really looked at the fact that the United States completely ignored the plight of these refugees and further shined light on this topic. From the standpoint of echoes and reflections, we also have an aligned activity, which I have shared with you in the working document, which looks at the voyage of the St. Louis. This particular activity is an activity that has students building their own mini documentary using the video platform of Eyewitness. It's free. Eyewitness itself is free to educators. To utilize the activities, you have to sign up for a free educator account. You can create students and groups and assign these activities to your students. All of the activities are built on the 4 C's, which are similar to the NCSS C3 framework. So we're asking students to consider, to learn about a specific topic or a subset of topics. We're then asking them to collect information from historical documents and visual history testimony. We're asking them to construct something, in this case, a little mini documentary of their own, and then we're asking them to share their product with their classmates and to communicate with them in constructive conversations. Eyewitness has over 400 activities at present. And they're across many different categories. The activity I just showed you from the St. Louis is a video activity, but they also have info quests, which have students doing the 4 C's, but creating a word cloud and retitling video clips and pulling out quotes they share with their classmates. Mini quests have varied product outcomes, collages, PSAs, pieces of art, poetry, journals, etc. The lessons are anywhere from 15 to 45-minute little mini lessons. Some focus on socio-emotional learning, others focus on building of specific skills or even topical content. iWalks allow you to take your students on a virtual field trip. In this case, you can go to the Horowitz-Wasserman Holocaust Memorial Plaza in Philadelphia. And then GeoStory activities are activities whose end product asks students to incorporate geospatial understandings into a particular journey during the Holocaust. We have ones on night, Schindler's List, and a variety of other activities. And then as regular users, you do not have access to what says interactive beta, but I will give you a little hint of what's coming if you've heard of the Dimensions in Testimony. Dimensions in Testimony, DIT, were featured on 60 Minutes a little while back. They're the holograms of the Holocaust survivors. And soon, hopefully this fall, your students will have the ability to actually talk to a survivor through their computer. We're in the process of beta testing it right now. So Eyewitness is a really amazing resource from our partners. We also have these watch videos, which you don't need to be signed in to access. And these are pre-curated clips across dozens of topics. You can also sort them by language. So for those of you that are teaching in communities that have a heavy amount of students that are speaking other languages, you can filter in some of these other languages to help connect them to the learning. There are topics related to other genocides that have occurred in the world, even American history topics like civil rights in America. So again, this is eyewitness.usc.edu. And again, another possibility for collaboration in the future once we get through the school year, because there's some really amazing stuff here. They also do webinars pretty frequently, so you guys can feel free to check them out at any point in time. So what is driving all of this? Why are we seeing a lack of acceptance? And one of the things that people historically have not liked to talk about is the fact that anti-Semitism, while it's so rampant in Germany, Nazi Germany, and Nazi-occupied Europe, it's also prevalent in the United States. The paper walls that were described to us by Esther and Liesel and Otto were buttressed by anti-Semitic and xenophobic attitudes from both the public and government institutions. As shared, earlier in our conversation, the great the tide of immigration, but anti-Semitism is also playing a significant role, and it really peaks between 1938 and 1945. In a 1938 poll, 60% of Americans thought Jews had objectionable qualities. 60% of Americans. Thankfully, the number is lower today. Nearly half believe that Jews had too much power in the United States, and as many as 20% said that they would sympathize if it occurred in the US. Jews were cited as posing a major threat to the country. This context made many Jewish Americans very reluctant to push for a more generous refugee policy, although they did continue to advocate for Jewish refugees through rallies and other public efforts. One of the most extreme examples of hesitation came through what was known as the Wagner-Rogers Bill. The Wagner-Rogers Bill was a bipartisan cross-house bill that was proposed in January of 1939 to bring 10,000 refugee children from Germany. It was definitely implied that most of these refugee children would be Jewish and that they would be housed in American homes. 61% of Americans were opposed to the bill. 61%. And these were children 14 years old and under. So the sponsors had support from the Children's Bureau, which was part of the Labor Department, as well as the American Federation of Labor and many private relief organizations. And the concept was that these were not people who were going to come here and take your jobs. But oppositional views included the fact that these children's circumstances did not require their removal from their home nations. Any such aid should go to poor American children. German children would eventually compete with Americans for jobs. The bill would violate the sanctity of the national quota system and its numerical restrictions, and that there would later be pressure to admit the children's family is also outside of the normal quotas, and that children should not be separated from their parents. Edith Roosevelt was a supporter of the bill. She was an absolute supporter of it, and she publicly spoke in favor of it. FDR never actually commented on the bill, but one of the most chilling quotes that was spoken in regard to the Wagner-Rogers bill came from a cousin of FDR's, Laura Delano Houterling, who said, 20,000 charming children would all too soon grow up into 20,000 ugly adults. And she basically made this comment at a dinner party. to J. Pierpont Moffat, who was the head of the State Department's Western European Division. And, you know, Robert Reynolds, who was a Democratic representative from North Carolina, said, "My heart goes out in sympathy to the refugee children. But I repeat, my heart beats in sympathy first for American sons and daughters in preference to children of fathers and mothers of any nation in the world." The bill died in committee. Now, fast forward a year later to the summer of 1940. Air attacks on Great Britain brought forth US support to evacuate British children. Congress enthusiastically passed what was known as the Mercy Ships Bill to allow British children, mostly non-Jewish, to the United States during the bombing of England by Germany. And the State Department and Justice Departments modified visitor visa requirements in order to accommodate. So there is, it's not a simplistic answer of, you know, we had the Depression, we couldn't accept immigrants. There was definitely lots of things going on behind the scenes. In another chilling quote, Breckinridge Long sent an intra-departmental memo. He was the Assistant Secretary of the State Department, which said, "We can delay and effectively stop for a temporary period of indefinite length the number of immigrants into the United States. We could do this by simply advising our consuls to put every obstacle in the way and to require additional evidence and to resort to various administrative devices which would postpone and postpone and postpone the granting of visas." And that, ladies and gentlemen, is not a typo. He said that in his memo 3 separate times, that he would postpone and postpone and postpone the granting of visas. Breckinridge Long, in my opinion, was one of the worst individuals in US government at that time. Many of his policies and modus operandi were characterized based on his anti-Semitism and xenophobia. And then following the US entry into the war, his paranoia of a fifth column. Some might argue that he had national security in mind, but several people then and today would argue that the restrictions that he promoted, comments that he made, far surpassed legitimate concerns for protecting the nation from spies, and that claims of Nazi spies, saboteurs, and Jewish refugees being forced to spy for the Nazis were excessively exaggerated and completely unfounded. So, you know, how can people leave if this is the situation in which they are placed? In our working document, I provided a reflect and connect question that you could use with your students, but for the purpose of time, I want to now take us back to today. In May of 2018, in a Pew Research poll that was given regarding refugees, and I know that there have been several conducted since, but not directly by Pew with the same questions, it was relayed that 51% of Americans believe that the United States does not have a responsibility to accept refugees. And while the United States is the largest resettlement country in the world and has an exceptional history of welcoming refugees, welcoming over 3 million refugees since 1975 for resettlement all over the world, it's obvious that there are continuing conflicting feelings about accepting refugees, and in particular, certain kinds of refugees. And there are various versions of this particular graphic on the internet. But I just want you to take a moment now and study it and see, like, what stands out to you about this particular image regarding support for refugees in the United States. So what stands out to you about this particular graphic? And again, there's so few of us. If anybody wants to just unmute your mic and share. My chocolate lab apparently had some opinions. But if there's any of you that want to unmute your mics and share, please feel free.
I will.
All right, go ahead, Kristen.
I think I think what I see is that the Albanians are white and the others are not as much. I mean, maybe Hungarians are, but but that's what I mean. It's clear that there's a racial context to this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and think about the time period of the Hungarians, like what might we be worried about, you know, and so the Cold War issues definitely play a role there. Shelby, I see you unmuted your microphone as well. Or maybe unintentionally. Gabriel, did you have something you wanted to add?
Well, the ethnic cleansing of the Albanians, the Kosovaris in the 90s versus the others, just political, kind of more so than ethnic cleansing, and attached to like the heartstrings, perhaps.
Yeah, yeah, I think that could definitely be a factor as well. And I think also like numbers, it's mentioning like several hundred versus like 65,000, 14,000. And I think numbers maybe perhaps, you know, can play a role here. When I hear students talking, yeah, like the Hungarians living in the communist country, wait, thank you. Oh, sorry, Shelby, that's okay. I've had problems with that too. But yeah, so the change in titles also, Monica, with the way the questions are being asked. And yeah, Chris, the Hungarians living in a communist country, like maybe they were worried about communist spies, was my thinking as well with that particular aspect. A lot of times when I hear students thinking about and talking about refugees, particularly students that haven't done a lot of research into the topic, like they think that if you're a refugee and you want to come here, like we just open the doors and you come in. Many don't realize that refugees are subject to the highest level of security of any category of traveler to the United States. And Syrian refugees in particular, because of the part of the world that they're coming from, are already taken through a rigorous and higher level of screening process than other refugees of other nationalities. The process can take anywhere from traditionally takes around 2 years, but can take almost 4 or 5 years. And less than 1% of refugees worldwide are actually ever settled. And so it's really fascinating, you know, to think about what the reality is. And you know, I see Shelby queuing in on the numbers as well, and Christy mentioning that our students might be influenced by, you know, television and social media opinions when they're talking about these topics. So for me, and how I handle them in my classroom is, you know, I engage them with testimonies like we've already been examining. And then I also bring in pieces of art. This particular piece of art comes to us from Unit 8 in Echoes and Reflections. It was created by a Jewish artist actually during the era of the Holocaust. His name is Felix Nussbaum. And Felix Nussbaum, unfortunately, would be captured. He was in hiding, and he would eventually perish during the era of the Holocaust. But I'd love to just give you, I'm going to just time you now. I'd like to give you 1 minute. And what I want you to do for this 1 minute is I want you to just look at the image. I want you to look at the different corners, the different things that you see. But I'm going to time it out, and I want you to take 1 moment, try not to be distracted by anything else, and just take a look at this image. All right, that was your minute. What are some observations? Again, feel free to share in the chat box or unmute your mic. I see Gabriel mentioning shame, fear, guilt, so close but so far. Purgatory from where it is trying to get to and where he comes from, armed only with melancholy and a backpack. There's some other things. Any other thoughts on this particular piece of art? The enclosed space makes him seem trapped, oppressed, etc. Europe is the focus on the globe. Monica mentions sadness and questioning what is outside the door. Architecture looks Mediterranean. He's alone, no family, it's desolate outside. There's this kind of barren tree, maybe some birds. All right, so we're gonna repeat the same exercise now with a more modern day piece of art. This particular piece, and Emrita mentions he might be frustrated. This modern day piece of art is also in the working document. It's actually part of a larger ADL lesson, not Echo's lesson, but a larger ADL lesson called Refugees Towards a Better Life. It was created by Diana Andrea Bahrain. And so I'd like to now, again, just have you looking at the image on your screen. And I'm going to restart my timer and have you repeat an examination of this image. All right, so again, in the chat box or by unmuting your mic, some reflections on this piece. Movement from dark to light. Gabriel mentioning mostly women and children as the men have stayed back, looking towards the heaven, pleading with intercession from a higher power. Feel like a play on sides othering and showing that they are just like others. Christy mentions heading out of darkness into light. It looks like primarily women, maybe fleeing somewhere there was war or oppression, the dark and stormy look, the sky is clear as they head east. Monica mentions interesting that most of the people are raising their hands up with hope, but the central character doesn't want to look. All right. And so this particular piece, the artist statement on it said, the refugee crisis is the topic of the hour. Newspapers write about it, people comment, governments make decisions, and even businesses are born based on the issue. The main reason I decided to illustrate the crisis in this manner is the fact that above all, there's a huge wave of anger crashing towards these people. I wanted to show the harsh situation that they are in and the fact that they only come in boats seeking a better life. They're in the middle of the sea, just waiting for a helping hand. And Gabriel, that is actually a great question, wanting a lithograph of this. You can actually get a copy of the lithograph. The ADL actually, they don't really have like a traditional bookstore or like place that you can buy like a ton of stuff, but they do actually sell lithographs of the art from this lesson, which is called We Were Strangers Too. And I'm looking really quick to see if I can pull the link for this particular piece. But then the proceeds go towards refugee and migrant educational efforts and civil rights support. So I'm going to just look really quick to see if I can find a copy of it. And I put a link to the full lesson in our working document. So you have the opportunity to see the entire lesson, which, as I mentioned, is entitled We Were Strangers Too. I'm going to put a link to, I couldn't quickly find the art that particular piece of art on the page where the stuff is for sale, but I'm putting a link to that particular store through the ADL. So we have these two pieces of art. And so for our second to last exercise of today, putting these two pieces side to side, I would just love to hear some reactions. So any reactions in the chat box or by verbalizing is totally fine. Hopelessness to hopeful. Yeah, there's definitely some amazing pieces in there. I could spend lots of money. All right, Kristen echoing Christie's hopelessness to hopeful. All right, and so now the contrast of being alone versus being packed in with others is an interesting one. I agree, Corey. I think it makes the experience itself very different. The use of shadows and shading in both pieces, Shane's pointing out. Marita says, seems like the men were trapped in societal conforms while the women were trying to flee, seeking for help. That's also a really fascinating observation. So I'd like to now ask us, in thinking collectively about this entire refugee experience, and we have only just brushed the surface, to head one last time to the mentee and come up with one final word that you want to share in reflection about the refugee experience. Okay, and so again, that mentee code is on the screen. And I see complicated now showing up as an additional word. I don't know if lost was on there before. It's interesting because you guys are such a small group. It's really interesting to see the words. Like sometimes I see people seeing slivers of hope as we reach the, towards the end of the program. But I think, the words that we have selected in our work together these past 3 days really do illustrate the reality of the situation that individuals that are refugees are facing in the world. And so it's important for students to understand, while a lot of the language today is the same, the policy and context of time is completely different. And it's therefore essential that students understand how these two time periods and refugee crises do have similarities, but in the fact that they are also different. And in conclusion, in the document, I have shared with you some examples of how ordinary citizens spoke out, trying to influence their government to change their policy towards refugees. And I've shared 3 particular stories, that of Martha and Waitsel Sharp, and an article in the USHMM's Holocaust Encyclopedia on them. Another rescue mission by Gilbert and Eleanor Krauss. And then lastly, the story of Varian Fry, who was a French journalist, or he was an American journalist based in France, who took extraordinary action in an attempt to aid those Jewish refugees in France and get them to the United States. So I feel like this 3 days went really, really quick. I have some additional suggestions. If you want to follow us on social media, please feel free to do so. Visit us at Echoes and Reflections at any time. We also have a lot of other professional development programs coming up in August. We have a lot of 1-hour webinars that you can tune into, as well as recordings of past webinars. And I want to also say a huge thank you to Gabriel for setting up this program for us, and for giving me the opportunity to work with you guys again. I always enjoy it. And I hope that everyone has a great start to their school year, whenever and however that is going to be. For me, it will be Monday, and it's hard to believe that we'll be going back, although I won't be having students for a few weeks yet. It's hard to believe that my summer is pretty much over. But I'm glad I had the opportunity to spend 6 different days of it with educators from the Social Studies Network, and I look forward to continued collaboration online.
Thank you so much for your facilitation and for everyone attending. And I look forward to that presentation on the newspapers and stuff and how to facilitate that. I think that'd be fascinating for educators and giving us as many different tools in our toolbox kind of thing.
Yeah, I appreciate it. And so let's connect on that once the kind of crazy start of the school year gets started. And Shane, good luck up in Maine. At least you've got a little bit of time. And I also did, if you guys can fill out the survey that I popped in the chat box, I would really appreciate it. But thank you all again for your rapt attention and participation. I really appreciate it.